We demand to know how an officer could feel his life is being threatened by someone who is obviously running away. Was it necessary to shoot Ricky in the head? Why not shoot to maim instead of to kill? Obviously, the officer was close enough to be able to get a clear shot. If the police were completely aware of the robbery attempt the Young brothers were allegedly planning, why didn't they simply surround the house and order all inside to come out? Where could they have gone? If they had come out shooting, we could understand retaliation by the police. But to have apparently set them up so that the situation was allowed to easily get out of hand and have a young life wasted was unnecessary on the part of the police.
Hi everybody, Steve the Amateur Historian, coming to you from North Portland to bring you a story. It's one of these sensitive, rough stories, but a story that deserves to be told and deserves to be kept alive because it's an unfortunate reminder of things that happened long before then and unfortunately things that have happened since. The story I'm going to bring you today is the 1975 killing of a 17-year-old African-American gentleman named Rickey Johnson. And this was one of the kind of most polarizing events to happen in Portland during the 1970s, and those that lived didn't know how tumultuous the 1970s could get. But this was a major story, and the shooting of Rickey Johnson was the fourth to happen to specifically a black man over the course of just a few months. But the cases that predated his shooting didn't really get a lot of attention. The media conveniently ignored them. They were instances that you just tried to sweep under the rug. But in terms of the Rickey Johnson shooting, it was a little bit different. I think with each successive shooting, there's more frustration, more outcry. Why are you not talking about these? Why is everybody acting like this is business as usual in this city? And the Rickey Johnson shooting was, I think, what kind of boiled things over. And so it's a more remembered event from our city's history. And so Rickey Johnson lived on Fremont Street here in this area. And what's interesting in relation to this case is his home where he grew up is just right behind me. He lived at, it would have been Fremont and Haight. But this next street right up here, only like 2 blocks down, this is Gattenbane Avenue. In a little turn, and we are now going north on Gattenbane Avenue. Sorry for the construction. It is still the hot months of the year. We only have to go a couple blocks north of Fremont and Gattenbane to get to a house. It was located at the southwest, I say was, it's still there. The house is located at southwest corner of Gattenbane and Shaver, which is only a few blocks away from here. So just a few blocks from where Rickey was living. So here's what happens. It's March 12th, 1975. A radio cab company driver named Martin Zamzow, if I'm pronouncing that right, gets a call from this house up here in North Portland on Gattenbane. Wants the driver to pick up some Chinese food from a place called the Pagoda, which used to be in the vicinity of 39th and Broadway, which is now Cesar Chavez and Broadway. Pretty far away to get Chinese food from here, or from there to here. And I also thought it was interesting that, you know, we think of things like DoorDash, Postmates, and all that stuff as this very present day, you know, 21st century thing, but apparently this was fairly common, that cab drivers used to do a similar thing, and they would be contacted and asked specifically to go pick up food for people. So it was kind of a 70s style DoorDash. But Zamzow, this was the request that went through. Zamzow went and picked up this Chinese food, and he went to this house. And he says that when he arrived, he had this box full of food. He walked up to the door. The door was opened by a man that he later said was Homer Zachary. And when he entered, Zachary closed the door and he had a baseball bat in his hand. So Zamzow figures he's walked into like a pretty dangerous situation. And another man in the house steps forward and he has a gun on him. Now, it's inferred that this was Rickey Johnson, although even giving testimony, Zamzow could not verify that the man he saw with the gun was Rickey Johnson. But considering the circumstances that were to follow, it's inferred that it was him. So they say, hey, you know, give us your money. And Zamzow apparently only had like $12 on them, which kind of frustrated them because they were hoping to get a bigger score. I don't know how much cab drivers carry on them. And they then tell Zamzow, they force him to get into a closet inside the house, and they say, stay here for 10 minutes, then you can go. The implication being that they wanted this guy to stay somewhere for a while so they could escape, and this guy wouldn't know who they were or where they were going. And so when Zamzow finally gets away, he immediately goes to the police with this situation, and an officer by the name of Kenneth Sanford is put on the case. I've seen interviews with this guy. He was a pretty mild-mannered fella, I gotta say. So this is the house right behind me on the southwest corner of Ganton, Main and Shaver. And yeah, so when Ken Sanford shows up here, they've set up this sting. There's police officers like just surrounding this area. And it's a pretty dangerous maneuver, which apparently Ken Sanford was accustomed to this. He was comfortable doing this. But he went into the house by himself. He had fellow officers out here, but he went into a house that presumably would have two people in there by himself, and he's dressed like the cab driver, and he's got a box that presumably has food in it, but he actually has his gun in there. And so he goes inside, you know, probably knowing what he's walking into. He goes up, Homer Zachary opens the door, and he goes inside, and Rickey Johnson appears there with his gun. They're pulling the same thing they did 2 days earlier, probably hoping for a better payout. And once Rickey Johnson is there with his gun, Sanford immediately pulls his gun from the box and says, freeze, don't move. This is after he says that Rickey Johnson said words to the effect of, like, give us all your money or I'm gonna blow your head off, not knowing it was a police officer. So now we have this standoff situation. And the story that was being peddled in the aftermath is that Rickey Johnson crouched. He crouched down into a shooting position. And when he did that, Sanford thought he was going to fire, and so he fired on Rickey Johnson first to keep himself from being shot. Now, there's a lot of problems with that, and even in Officer Sanford's own testimony of events, he implies a different story. But that was all that was really reported on, was that Rickey Johnson crouched, and the implication is when you crouch, you're crouching into a shooting position, which created this impression that he was only all too ready to shoot this guy. And in his, like, this is the officer, the only one who's, like, you know, all these other officers are surrounding the house, but they can't see what's happening in there. They can only really report on what they heard and what they saw afterwards. But in Officer Sanford's own retelling of events, he says that Rickey Johnson keeps the gun on him and he crouches down, but he's starting to slowly maneuver away. And the implication is that he's like doing kind of slow steps towards the dining room. They're in the living room area and he's making steps toward the dining room. And in his own statements, Sanford says words to the effect of, like, I thought he was going to shoot me. I felt like he was going to shoot me, and, like, I knew I was going to shoot him. Like, he already, like, it was like he thought in his mind before he did it, like, I'm going to do this. This is going to happen. And it seems as Johnson was kind of slowly maneuvering towards the dining room, I guess he probably just, I mean, based on the circumstances of what happened, if you're going to believe his story, Sanford's story, is that when he gets close enough to the dining room, Rickey Johnson probably drops his gun and then is going to run for it. He's going to run through the dining room and probably escape out back and try to escape the situation, which I don't blame him one bit. Being a young black man in this area at that time with a police officer having a gun on you, I'm sure it went through his mind, like, this officer could just shoot me dead right now, and whatever he says, the public will believe. And for a while, that's kind of what happened. But I found it very revealing and telling that even in Sanford's own statement of events, his telling of it implies that all Rickey Johnson was trying to do was trying to escape. And when he turned to run, Sanford must have shot him then, which means he shot a guy trying to get away who did not have his gun even pointed at him. This wasn't a standoff, two people pointing guns at each other, and he finally decided, I'm in danger, I need to shoot first. And two really critical elements of this case that belie any notion that Rickey Johnson was trying to shoot Officer Sanford, or that Officer Sanford was in the danger that it was implied he was in, was Rickey Johnson was shot in the back of the head. Now, if they're facing each other, obviously, how does that happen? When someone gets shot in the back of the head in a situation like that, odds are they were shot trying to run away. You can, all these instances of people, prisoners trying to escape police custody, all this stuff, they always get shot in the back or in the back of the head when they try to flee. So that alone is an implication that Rickey Johnson was not firing on Officer Sanford, but trying to escape. So there was no justifiable reason to shoot in that scenario. There's also the fact that when Rickey fell dead, because again, he was trying to maneuver into the dining room, he was found, his dead body was in the dining room, and his gun was in the living room some 10 feet from his body. So again, I think what happened was he kept the gun on Sanford, because if he didn't, Sanford would have just jumped him or probably shot him. And when he got just close enough to the door, he threw the gun down and tried to run. And that's why the gun was found still there in the living room, and he was in the dining area a good distance from his gun. And here's another thing, is the gun wasn't loaded. There was no bullets in the gun that Rickey Johnson had, and there was no clip found in the house. And I think even Homer Zachary said, like, when we had the gun, it was never loaded. It was just, it was like an intimidation tactic, which goes to show that even though they were pulling this, robbery scam, if they were going to hurt somebody, they weren't like there to shoot to kill. Now, obviously, Officer Sanford couldn't have known that the gun wasn't loaded, but, you couldn't make the claim that Rickey Johnson did even shoot at him. I guarantee you, if it wasn't shown that gun wasn't even loaded, and people actually saw that and it was reported on, it wouldn't surprise me if someone, either Sanford or someone in the police, tried to fabricate the idea that he did fire. He did shoot first. He shot when he tried to run away. You can't even make that inference because the gun wasn't loaded. And another thing that implies there was some distance made between Rickey Johnson and Officer Sanford by the time he was shot was Rickey Johnson had been wearing a hat. And obviously if he was shot in the back of the head, you could test that. And they tested his hat. There was no powder or primer residue from the weapon, which that was established when during like the autopsy and the coroner's examination of Rickey and all the evidence. It was determined that meant that he was shot from no less than 6 feet away. So they weren't like face to face. He wasn't coming at Officer Sanford. He was going the other way. Shooting him was completely unnecessary and unjustified. Even in the official report on this event, they said that the implication was that Rickey Johnson was trying to drop the gun and run away. Even with just those basic details, it was pretty obvious what had transpired at that home, which is, it's nice and pretty and fixed up, and they got a flower garden, but back then in 1975, it was a vacant house. That was probably the primary reason they used it, was it was a house that couldn't be tied to them. It was a house that they didn't have to worry about some family coming home and catching them in the act. They couldn't be tied to it, and they didn't have to worry about random witnesses, so they could pull this scam and then disappear and potentially go back and use it again later. Homer Zachary made a run for it. I mean, the moment the bullets started flying, he was probably thinking, how long is it going to be before I'm next? He gunned him down right in front of me. He's probably going to turn and shoot me too. So he fled the house, but because it was surrounded by other officers, he didn't get very far, and they apprehended him. And witnesses, on that block said that the manner, because they said, when Zachary saw that he was surrounded, he put his hands up and gave up. He was like, I'm gonna get shot if I keep trying to run. And of course the police jumped him, slammed him down to the ground, utilized excessive force under those circumstances. And one witness even heard when it was asked about the status of Rickey Johnson in that immediate aftermath. And I know in certain stressful situations people get mad, but at least one witness at the scene said that when the question of how Rickey was doing was brought up, one of the officers said, "The bitch is dead," or "That bitch is dead." Which almost, I understand we say things out of anger, but that almost implied like there was this great pride, like this was some career criminal, organized crime figure that they've been after for years and they finally got him, when it was just a 17-year-old kid trying to run away. I guarantee you, if Rickey Johnson was a 17-year-old white boy, even if he had a loaded gun, if he would have just dropped it and tried to run, they would have chased him down. And Sanford had people surrounding the house. If he let Rickey Johnson get away, the other officers still would have pounced on it. They still would have gotten him. So, and he knew that. He knew he was the prime figure in this whole operation. He knew there was guys out there, and if Rickey escaped the house, they'd tackle anybody that tried to flee that location. And he still shot him. And it was just such an unfortunate set of circumstances for a young man early in his life. And I read that, his father told him, like, don't get mixed up in anything. Don't do anything that's going to give the police an excuse, or give yourself, I guess, an excuse to have an encounter with the police, because they'll kill you. And that essentially ended up being what happened. I also saw that Rickey Johnson, it said that he attended George Washington High School, which is interesting, and I assume it had to be because it was the 1970s and they were trying to do that whole busing thing to try to make it so there weren't so many schools that were pretty much all white, or like Jefferson High School, where a lot of kids in this area went, which was primarily black students. I mean, we're up in North Portland, Northeast Portland here, north of even like the original town of Albina. His family lived kind of where the Boyce and Elliott neighborhood meet. And George Washington High School is on like Stark and like 14th or something like that. It's way off in Southeast Portland, several miles from here. But in the case of his shooting, it really finally bubbled to the surface what had been going on for years and just hadn't quite, there's always one event that is the catalyst that, really blows things up. And in terms of police brutality, the shootings that have been happening, the Rickey Johnson shooting was the one that really finally bubbled everything over the surface. And unfortunately, due to the type of town Portland was, a lot of people were more than happy to believe anything the police were saying about what was going on. The police could pretty much do and say whatever they wanted, and the city government pretty much had their back. The mayor of the city at the time, Neil Goldschmidt, who prided himself on being kind of a progressive at that time, he pretty much stayed mum on the matter as long as he could, because he didn't want to anger either sides. He didn't want to anger his police force. He didn't want to anger the black community that he was trying to, part of his thing was he was trying to make that better too. So he unfortunately was kind of inactive in all of this and didn't really speak until he was forced to. And of course, from the police side, they were all 100% behind Officer Sanford and his actions. They felt they were completely justified, even though he himself in his own statement of events said that he pretty much shot a kid that was trying to run away. And the police chief at the time, a guy named Bruce Baker, when, commenting on the situation, what he said was, there should be no hesitation in defending another or your own life. For protection from physical harm, you have the authority of the law and the system of justice we are sworn to uphold. In the ultimate case where life is endangered, you should follow our policy and defend yourself. Which is all good and fine. Problem is, it doesn't work both ways. So in this case, he said, the officer's life was in danger because an unloaded gun was pulled on him. But it was obvious the kid was trying to escape. All that mumbo jumbo about protecting yourself is good and fine when you're an officer of the law, but when you're a member of the public and the roles are reversed, you don't have that same protection. You don't have that same justice. The city's going to side with the officer. They're not going to believe you for a second that this officer was unhinged, even though it happens all too frequently. So when it comes to a citizen defending themselves from an officer of the law that means them unjust harm, all of a sudden the law and justice aren't quite there for you. But ultimately, due to the pressure that was being put on by, people in the city, the community, ultimately a public inquest was held, which public inquests in instances like this were not too common, especially not in Portland. So this was kind of a big deal, even though it was probably going to be tainted, and was tainted to the police side's favor. It was still something. It was still something where the details of what happened had to be more bore out and made more present to the public. And anybody that looked at the accounts of what happened, even in Officer Sanford's own story, could see that the shooting wasn't justified. regardless of what they decided at the inquest. But let's be honest. Oftentimes, when a city government agrees to do a public inquest, it's always said that it's done with the purpose of being transparent, fair to all sides, but oftentimes, when a public inquest is held, the primary objective is to quell whatever unrest is happening at the time and make it look like we did something about it. And as far as I can see, this particular inquest into the death of Rickey Johnson was no different. Law enforcement was treated with kid gloves. Officers were allowed to testify and create as much sympathy towards Ken Sanford's situation as possible. In fact, one officer, the one that reportedly traveled with Sanford to the house where this happened, told that classic story, like while they were on their way, Sanford said words to the effect of, you know, if I don't make it out of this alive, tell my family I love them very much, which of course is done to get sympathy from the 6-person jury that they had there. And my question is, well, if there was that much fear and concern about Officer Sanford's safety, that he would have to do the whole, like, I may not make it out of this alive, tell my family I love them shtick. If it was really that dangerous, then why in a sting operation with so many officers there, why was it even considered that he should just go in there and do this all by himself, potentially facing 2 different individuals, both of whom may have been armed with some kind of weapon? There wasn't even an officer, like, right behind him at the door, ready to assist him at any moment. They were just kind of surrounding the general area. If it was really that dangerous, why did they allow him to go in there alone? I mean, the fact of the matter is, this was an extremely reckless and not well thought out sting, and it was widely criticized. It was the Washingtonian newspaper, which was the newspaper for Washington High School where Rickey Johnson went. They openly analyzed it and said, like, this, the whole concept of this sting was set up to fail to begin with. This was set up pretty much making it almost inevitable that a violent altercation would happen and that ultimately the police would end up having to gun down the suspect in this case. And when Sanford himself went up to testify on the matter, his telling of the story reiterated the idea that Rickey Johnson was trying to run. And obviously that was the case. He was holding a gun that wasn't loaded. And even in his telling of events, he said words to the effect of he felt like he'd been waiting too long to protect himself. Like this had been going, he'd been waiting too long. Too long for what? How was the moment he pulled the gun on you to the few seconds later where he's inching to the wall, how are you any less safe here than you were here? Didn't he have the gun on you the whole time? So, you know, really this reiterated that this was an unjustified shooting, but of course, it was clearly obvious that the police were not going to be grilled on their actions, why they chose to follow this type of procedure in a situation like this, turn it into this seemingly big elaborate sting that was actually very poorly planned out and almost destined to have something go awry. Still, when all is said and done, the 6-person jury for this inquest voted 5-1 to essentially say that this was justifiable homicide, that Officer Sanford was justified under those circumstances to do what he did. His actions were justified. The one dissenting vote was from the one black person that was on this jury. It was 5 white people and 1 black person. And, you know, for the most part, public sentiment among the majority of the white population in the city hadn't changed that much. The attitude was generally, well, Rickey Johnson was trying to commit a crime, and so you set yourself up for that experience. It's more of that classic victim-blaming nonsense. And while I've talked, obviously, a lot about Officer Ken Sanford, he's the one that did the shooting. In the end, I actually almost hold him less responsible than, say, the Portland police as a whole. And there were even writings about this situation that discuss, like, the problem isn't Ken Sanford. The problem is the Portland police, the ongoing racial attitudes that permeated through practically every precinct in the city, the fact that they didn't take immediate responsibility for this and say like, oh, you know, this shouldn't have happened. It shouldn't have gone down this way. We shouldn't have planned it this way. The sting was poorly done. You know, looking at it objectively, the shooting was not justified, but of course the attitude was, this is justified. You know, police have to face dangers every day, and people don't understand how hard it is to be a police officer, which I can understand that to an extent. But that was the attitude, was that this was justified under the circumstances. But the fact of the matter is, when I look at Ken Sanford, I see him getting interviewed, and he's kind of soft-spoken, and he had a relatively good record to this point. He was known for, if there was somebody in crisis, he was often the one that would go and assess it. There was one instance where someone specifically asked for him. He didn't have this same crooked record that a lot of police officers had during that time. And in the aftermath of the shooting of Rickey Johnson and everything that followed, it was pretty clear that this had a drastic effect on him. He didn't walk away from this, I don't think, feeling justified the way that the rest of the police force tried to say he was. I think he was messed up by this. When he was interviewed and asked how it affected him, he kind of gave this like, oh, well, I don't know, kind of answer. But not long after this happened, he got in trouble for, it said, taking intoxicants while off duty, which makes me think he was probably drinking a lot. It may have been drugs, but I think he was starting to drink. His wife ended up leaving him, and by 1977, he ended up going on disability for PTSD, and it was just obvious that he was affected by this. It wasn't like other instances where, you know, an officer guns down a person of color and, you know, you're affected by the fact that you're shooting someone, but you're not that affected. You're not as affected as you might be, say, shooting a white person, and that's where the racial implications come in. But it seems clear to me that Ken Sanford was overall a cut above most other officers, and I genuinely think under those circumstances, obviously he should have known what he was getting into, but I don't think he gunned down Rickey Johnson in cold blood. I think he genuinely panicked under the circumstances. And he was just really messed up, and he ended up having to leave town afterwards. I'm not justifying his actions, but what I'm saying is if you want to say Ken Sanford is the beginning and the end of the problem, you're missing the bigger picture, which is this sloppily planned out sting, and then the police did everything in their power to justify this. They didn't even acknowledge that this was an unfortunate accident and maybe we should have done things differently under the circumstances. There was no sympathetic, apologetic nature from the police in regards to the victim that was killed in this case. In fact, they referred to him as a bitch right after he was shot when it was asked if he was all right. They said that bitch is dead. You know, all the police did was justify. And even at the public inquest, they were allowed every chance in the world to justify this. And it seemed the only person that felt kind of crappy about it and walked away not doing so well was the officer that actually did the shooting. So the greater problem was the power that the police were allowed to have at the time. The problem was the racist culture that permeated the police department at the time. The racist attitude that permeated most people in a city that was primarily white. And I'm sure a lot of white people who thought because they didn't use racial slurs that they couldn't possibly be racist. Or that because they had black friends, they couldn't possibly be racist. And then, of course, the lackadaisical do-nothing city government. It was like that with Terry Shrunk, and unfortunately with Neil Goldschmidt, who again, you know, promoted himself as this progressive politician who wanted to improve things in the black community. In the end, he kind of had the same thing to say that they all did, like, oh, it's an unfortunate tragedy, but I think what we need to do now is, you know, learn our lessons and begin to heal and move on. Which is real easy to say when you're not being adversely affected by someone. I dare Neil Goldschmidt to go to the home of Rickey Johnson's family and say that to their face. Well, it's a tragedy, but let's move on. So it was the culture. It was the culture of the city. It was the culture of the police. It was the culture of the government at the time that I think were at greatest fault above Ken Sanford. And I mean, if anything, if you can even call it positive, if anything good really came out of the Rickey Johnson shooting, was that it shined a greater light on these shootings that had happened beforehand. It got a lot more attention from the public, obviously through the public inquest, got more attention. And while there was still kind of this laissez-faire, well, you know, we probably had a coming attitude among a lot of white Portlanders, it is one of those stories that through time is still something that gets talked about. It still gets written about. When you talk about the civil rights movement in Portland, the Rickey Johnson shooting always comes up. It is a primary topic of discussion. And while it shouldn't be held above the shootings of any other black man, regardless of the circumstances, his shooting still keeps attention on that certain part of history that a lot of people, unfortunately, in this city either want to forget, want you to forget, or they want to act like it didn't really happen. But it did, and it's a history that deserves to be told, and it deserves to be remembered. No matter what Rickey Johnson was doing, no matter what he got himself involved in, the circumstances surrounding his death were completely unjustified. Yes, he was in the midst of trying to commit a crime. He was also doing it with an unloaded gun. He wasn't out there shooting random citizens on the street. He wasn't doing drive-bys. And the circumstances of that situation, there was no reason he shouldn't have just been arrested. Him and Homer Zachary on the scene. The bullets should not have flown. Pure and simple. And that is my telling, I guess you could say, my delving into the murder of Rickey Johnson back in March 1975. And it's a case that, you know, you can dive in so long. I could have done a 3-hour video about this, diving into all the elements, all the racism, all the history leading up to the Rickey Johnson shooting. I could delve a lot more into the police corruption of the time. I could delve a lot more into the city corruption at the time. And the events that followed after this that showed that despite this public inquest and despite all this chatter about how things were going to change and the police were going to become more sympathetic and they were going to take these training courses and all that stuff, the fact of the matter is, a few years down the road, you have the possum incident at the Burger Barn. In 1985, you have the chokehold killing of Lloyd Stevenson. Racism in the Portland police force was far from going away, far from fading away, just because this particular shooting got more attention. So, unfortunately, Rickey Johnson's shooting was just one in a multitude of horrible events that happened before and after his death. So, all of that said, I would like to thank you so much for stopping by. I hope you know, if you didn't know about this case, hopefully you learned something. And if you want to learn more, there's a lot of outlets. There's lots of written pieces. There's newspaper articles about this case, discussing it and all the circumstances going into it. Mine is just a, you know, retelling of these events and what happened afterwards and kind of how the same old nonsense was allowed to go on. So, as always, you know, if you're new to the channel or haven't gotten around to it, remember to like, share, subscribe. If you want to help my channel grow. I also have a Patreon. If you want to help out there, it makes it a lot easier to do videos like this, keep creating content for my channel. The link to that is in the description with this video, as well as the links to my Instagram, Facebook, Reddit, subreddit, and my TikTok as well. So all that said, thank you so much again for stopping by. Really appreciate it. Until next time, this has been Steve, the Amateur Historian.